You're watching Family Revenge Secrets, true-to-life dramas about family, betrayal, and the quiet courage it takes to protect the ones you love. If these stories help you feel less alone, consider subscribing and leaving a comment about where you're listening from. It helps more people find the light in their own dark hallways. I've learned that a Mother's Day is measured less by hours and more by small repairs. You patch a knee on a pair of jeans. You glue the wing back on a paper airplane. You tell your child the truth gently and your husband the truth firmly. And you hope, by bedtime, the house isn't leaning too far in one direction. It was a Thursday, the kind of afternoon that makes an ordinary neighborhood look like a postcard. Bikes on their sides, sprinklers making rainbows, a sky so blue even old regret seems softer under it. I was standing on our front path with a plate of peanut butter cookies cooling in my hands, the smell drifting like a promise toward my 7-year-old son. "Ethan," I called, "remember one cookie now, the rest after dinner." He turned from our front hedge where he'd been showing a doodle to the woman next door, Grace. She had that neighborly kind of prettiness, sun freckles, calm smile, a ponytail that said she jogged at sunrise. She waved at me. I waved back. It was nothing, really. It was everything. Ethan ran to me in that half-skip kids do when they haven't yet figured out how to carry joy and balance at the same time. He reached for the plate and I bent down to meet him, steadying the cookies with one hand and his elbow with the other. "Say thank you," I said. He did. Then he turned his round, trusting face back toward the hedge and said a word that did not belong to that moment, that afternoon, or to me. "Mommy, can Grace have one?" At first, I thought I misheard. Wind can make a word into another word if you let it. A mother's mind can twist the letter M into anything but what it is. But the plate wobbled in my hands and one cookie slid to the ground and the ants nearby broke rank like men released from duty. "Ethan," I said, slow as Sunday. "What did you call her?" He blinked, the way children blink when they've walked into a room where adults store the weather. He didn't look sorry. He looked confused that I was confused. "Mommy," he repeated, small voice, big word. "I am 53 years old. I have lived through the bad haircut of 89, the panic of 08, 2 miscarriages, 1 melanoma, and the quiet indignities that collect when a woman gives her best hours to family instead of a resume. I have been called many names, Lynn, Linda, ma'am, miss by people who should know better. But I have only ever been mommy to one person in this world, and I had him later than most. I still check that he's breathing in the middle of the night. Don't ask me why. Habit is love wearing comfortable shoes. Grace's smile faltered. It was almost nothing, like a pull in a sweater you only find because your finger catches it. "Oh, Ethan," she said lightly, "I think your mom means." "Mom," he corrected, looking up at me, seeking the shore. I wanted to be ashore, I did. I wanted to laugh it off and blame the wind, the ants, the way kids borrow words the way they borrow pencils, without knowing who sharpened them. But something in my chest tapped twice like a code. My husband, Richard, had been coming home later. Meetings, traffic, the kind of reasons you can't disprove without following a man down the highway with a flashlight and an appetite for humiliation. "It's just a word," Grace said, shrugging it off. "Happens all the time at school, right, Ethan? Kids mix things up." Maybe they do, but mothers don't. We know the smell of our child's hair after a swim lesson. We know the thud of their feet on the stairs. We know the shape of their word for us, the one they fought through milk teeth to make. When Ethan's first, Mama, came, it was in a grocery aisle next to canned peaches. I cried into the cart handle like a woman at a wedding who brought tissues for everyone but herself. "Let's get you inside," I told Ethan. My voice was soft, the way you talk to a cake you don't want to collapse. We took 3 steps, and he tugged my hand. "Can we bring a cookie to Mommy?" He stopped this time, catching my face the way a boy catches a baseball that is heavier than he expects. "To MS. Grace," I said. "MS. Grace," he repeated dutifully as if he were copying from a chalkboard he couldn't see. I handed him a cookie and watched him carry it back to the hedge. The plate felt heavier. Joy often does when you're afraid to set it down. Grace accepted the cookie with 2 fingers, careful not to brush Ethan's, careful the way a person gets when they know what they're doing matters too much. "Thank you," she called to me. "He's a sweetheart." "He is," I said. I tried to smile the way you smile after a dental cleaning. Mouth open, eyes steady, everything numb. There are sounds a house makes when a truth is coming, a door that won't latch, a faucet that won't stop. That afternoon, our mailbox creaked, though no one touched it. A bird flew into the glass and left a print of dust, like the chalk outline of a small, brave body. And inside me, something so old and animal lifted its head and sniffed the wind. Richard pulled into the driveway right then, as if summoned by the part of me that still believed he could fix things with a joke and a kiss. He got out, loosened his tie, waved at Grace, kissed Ethan's hair, and placed his palm on the small of my back the way men do when they want the world to know a woman belongs to someone. "How was your day?" he asked. "Ordinary," I said. I don't know why I lied. Maybe because the truth, spoken too soon, can blow the roof off a house. He scooped Ethan up, spinning him once. "Hey, buddy, make any new art for the fridge?" "Uh-huh," Ethan said. "Mommy helped me draw a boat." Richard looked at me, amused. "I didn't know you were in a nautical mood." I held his gaze until he looked away. Sometimes the only way to keep from drowning is to stand very still and pretend the water isn't there. Dinner was chicken and green beans and the kind of silence that turns a clink of silverware into a cymbal. Ethan talked about a spelling test. Richard talked about a client with unreasonable expectations. He said it like a man who wanted credit for enduring them. I nodded and passed the salt. In marriages like ours, salt is a peace offering. After dishes, I walked the plate back to Grace to be neighborly, to be normal, to be anything but the woman I felt myself becoming. She opened her door at the first knock, too fast, like a person waiting for news. "I think Ethan mixed up a word today," I said, holding out the plate. She stared at it as if I were handing her a subpoena. "Kids," she said and tried to laugh. That's when I saw it, quick and human and not nearly rehearsed enough to be safe, the flash in her eyes, not guilt exactly. More like a small animal hearing its own name in the dark. Grace's smile went thin. "Everything okay, Linda?" I wish I could say yes. I wish I could say the word didn't matter. But there are words that don't just label things, they move them. They change the furniture in a life. They open doors you didn't know your house had. Behind Grace, the hallway light was on. A second toothbrush hung in her bathroom like a question mark. "Everything's fine," I said, and my voice shocked me with how steady it sounded. But I saw her eyes, wide, startled, a deer at the edge of the road, and I knew we had both heard the same thing, not a word, but a warning. On mornings when the Arizona sun spread itself over the cul-de-sac, my life looked flawless enough to be printed on a real estate brochure. A tidy lawn, a swing set that creaked but held, a kitchen window where I stood most days, coffee in hand, watching my boy wait for the school bus with his backpack bouncing against his narrow shoulders. From the outside, you'd say we were steady. My husband, Richard, an insurance man with the kind of voice that soothed anxious clients into signing contracts. My son, Ethan, bright-eyed, 7 years old, forever leaving his crayons under the couch cushions. And me, Linda, 53, a woman who once taught literature but traded Chaucer and Dickinson for parent-teacher meetings and packed lunches. I told myself it was a fair trade. After all, you don't grade essays at midnight when you're a mother. You grade your own sacrifices. You cross out the word career and replace it with family, circle it twice, and tell yourself it's the better sentence. Richard liked to say we were lucky. He had a wife who kept a house like clockwork. I had a husband who kept the bills paid. Ethan had both of us. On Sundays, we sat in our pew at St. Andrew's, the 3 of us side by side, the sunlight slanting through stained glass onto our clasped hands. A picture, if you didn't know how to tilt the frame. But I had begun to notice the tilting. It started in small, repairable ways. Richard working later, the old excuse of traffic becoming a refrain, his phone lighting up in the dark, screen turned away from me, his tie carrying the faintest trace of perfume I didn't wear. At first, I filed these moments in the drawer of middle age. Men get restless, wives get tired, houses breathe with sighs. Still, I told myself we were fine, better than fine. That Thursday evening, after Ethan's slip of the tongue in front of Grace, I set the table as if nothing were strange. Forks on the left, knives on the right, napkins folded. Chicken roasting in the oven. Richard walked in late again, loosening his tie, carrying the smell of someone else's cologne like a guest he hadn't asked permission to bring. He kissed my cheek absently, his lips cool, as if the act were a habit rather than a choice. "Big day," he said, pouring himself a glass of wine before washing his hands. "Client was impossible, you wouldn't believe the paperwork." I smiled thinly. I probably would. Ethan bounded in, clutching his spelling workbook, asking for help. I bent beside him at the counter, tracing letters with my finger, showing him how to turn a shaky B into something proud enough for the teacher's red check mark. His hair smelled like sunshine and dust. His trust was unshaken. He called me Mommy with a smile that erased every line on my face. And yet, the word lingered from earlier that day, the one he had given away to another woman. It gnawed at me even as I praised his neat handwriting. Dinner was quiet, too quiet. Richard spoke about policies and deductibles, Ethan about a boy in class who could whistle through his teeth. I nodded in all the right places. But inside, I was turning the word Mommy over like a coin, wondering who else had been spending it. After Ethan went to bed, I walked through our house with its framed photographs, our wedding day, Ethan's first steps, vacations at the Grand Canyon. They looked solid in their frames, like proof of a love that had weathered decades. But I remembered something an old priest once told me at confession. The devil doesn't always knock down the front door. Sometimes he slips in with the groceries. That night, as I gathered the laundry, I found a child's drawing folded into Ethan's jeans pocket. Two stick figures stood side by side, both women, both labeled with the same word. Mommy. My throat closed. Maybe I thought it was nothing. Maybe he'd meant his teacher. Maybe Grace had helped him with homework once. Maybe children double name the people who feed them cookies. I pressed the paper flat, smoothed the wrinkles, and placed it under my pillow as if it were a warning I wasn't yet ready to share. Sleep would not come. I listened to Richard's steady breathing beside me, the sound of a man without guilt, or with guilt so practiced it disguised itself as peace. My eyes traced the ceiling, counting cracks like stars. Every so often, Ethan coughed in his sleep down the hall, and I wanted to run to him, assure him that he only had one mother, that her arms would always be enough. But the truth lay there beside me, restless as I was. Something in our so-called perfect life had already begun to split, and the crack was widening. And once a word as sacred as Mommy escapes to another woman's mouth, it never entirely returns. Morning has a way of disguising things. Sunlight paints over the cracks, coffee steam fogs the kitchen window, and the neighborhood looks harmless again. Children shuffle onto buses, dogs bark at fences, and women like me sweep crumbs from counters, convincing ourselves that routine is proof of peace. But after Ethan's mistake, after that word that slipped into daylight and refused to be unseen, I began to notice everything differently. It started with Grace. She lived just 3 houses down, in the pale blue bungalow with geraniums in pots by the porch. I had always thought of her as pleasant, a younger woman in her 40s, cheerful in a way that drew neighbors to her yard during block parties. She baked lemon squares, volunteered for the food drive, and waved whenever she jogged past. A good neighbor, I had called her more than once. but now my son had called her mommy. That morning, as I walked Ethan to the bus stop, I caught him glancing toward Grace's yard with an almost conspiratorial smile, as though he expected her to appear and wink back. And when she did appear, watering her flowers in a soft sweater, Ethan lit up. He raised his hand high. "Hi, MS, Grace," he shouted. Her eyes flicked toward me first, quick as a match strike, before she smiled at Ethan. "Morning, champ. Did you ace that spelling test?" Ethan nodded proudly. I froze. How did she know about the spelling test? I swallowed hard. "We'll be late for the bus, honey," I said, tugging Ethan's hand. On the way back, I slowed near Grace's house. She was bent over her flowers, humming. For a moment, I almost convinced myself I was being paranoid. But then she glanced up, caught me watching, and her humming stopped mid-note. She stood, brushed dirt from her gloves, and waved again. The wave was polite, but her eyes gave something away: hesitation, guilt, I couldn't tell. That afternoon, I ran into Mrs. Carver, the oldest resident on the street, known for tending roses that bloomed even in drought. She leaned on her cane, and as we talked about the heat, her voice lowered. "Such a sweet girl, that Grace," she said, raising that little one mostly on her own. I frowned. "Little one?" "Oh, yes," Mrs. Carver nodded. "Haven't you seen her daughter? The prettiest curls, always running around their porch. Looks just like Grace." My pulse spiked. "I must have missed her," I said. Mrs. Carver chuckled. "Well, she must keep her inside when you're around, Linda. But the child's father, now that's a mystery. Folks whisper, but nobody really knows who he is." I walked home with my grocery bag cutting into my palm, each step heavier than the last. Grace had a daughter I had never seen, a daughter apparently that other neighbors already knew about. Why had I never noticed? Or had she hidden the child from me, and if so, why? That evening, while folding laundry, I overheard Ethan humming a tune in his room. I peeked in. He sat cross-legged on the rug, sketching with his crayons. "What are you drawing, sweetheart?" I asked. He grinned. "It's me and you and Mommy Grace." The crayon froze in his hand. He looked up quickly, realizing what he'd said. His cheeks flushed. "Did Daddy tell you to call her that?" I asked softly. "No," Ethan whispered. "It's just sometimes she tells me stories like you do, and she sings when she makes me sandwiches. She said I could call her whatever I wanted." The words clamped around my heart. Sandwiches? Stories? How many moments had been stolen from me without my knowing? I didn't scold him. He's only 7, I reminded myself. A boy doesn't invent betrayal. He learns it from the adults around him. I kissed his hair and tucked the drawing under his pillow, telling him to wash up for dinner. But when Richard came home that night, later than usual, his explanation blurred into the background. Something about a client, something about traffic. I stood at the sink, washing dishes that were already clean, and thought of sandwiches being made in another kitchen, just 3 houses away. 2 days later, while watering my own garden, Mrs. Jennings from across the street stopped to chat. She leaned in, her voice conspiratorial. "Have you noticed Richard spending time at Grace's place? I saw his car there last week. Thought maybe he was helping with repairs." Her tone was casual, but her eyes were sharp, curious. I forced a laugh. "Richard, he can barely fix a leaky faucet." She smiled, unconvinced, and walked on. The ground seemed to tilt under me. Everyone saw something but me. That night, unable to sleep, I slipped outside. The moonlight turned the street silver. From the corner of my yard, I could see Grace's window glowing softly. A shadow moved across the curtain, a man's shadow, broad-shouldered, familiar. My stomach turned. The house I thought was perfect was beginning to feel like a stage set, and I was the only actor who didn't know the script. Inside, Ethan stirred in his sleep and murmured a word. Not Mom, not Grace, just Mommy. But I couldn't tell anymore who he meant. The first betrayal is rarely a scream. It is a whisper in the dark, a thread you tug without meaning to, only to watch the whole fabric of your life unravel. Mine came not from a confession or a letter, but from a toothbrush, blue plastic, small enough for a child's hand, tucked where it had no business being. It was a Saturday morning when I found it. Richard had just left for a quick stop at the office, though offices rarely called men in khakis and polos on weekends. Ethan was sprawled on the living room rug, building a crooked tower of Legos. I carried a basket of laundry upstairs, humming a hymn from my childhood, trying to chase the heaviness from my chest. In the bathroom, I set the towels in neat stacks, opened the cabinet for toothpaste, and there it was, a toothbrush I didn't recognize. Bright blue. Cartoon dolphin painted on the handle. Too new to belong to Ethan, who used a Spider-Man brush worn to the nub. I froze. Water dripped steadily from the faucet, ticking the seconds. I picked it up, turned it in my hand. The bristles were damp, recently used. "Ethan?" I called, trying to sound casual. "Yes, Mom." His voice drifted up from the rug. "Did you get a new toothbrush?" "No, mine's downstairs," he answered. "Daddy got me a new one at Grace's house. He said I could keep it there." The basket slipped from my arm, towels spilling like surrender flags across the tile. My mouth went dry. "At Grace's house?" "Uh-huh," Ethan said, still busy with his tower. "She has toothpaste that tastes like strawberries." I pressed the toothbrush against my palm until the bristles bent. Strawberry toothpaste. A toothbrush kept at her house. My son knew more of her sink than I did. When Richard returned an hour later, carrying a bag of groceries like evidence of good husbandry, I held up the toothbrush. "What's this?" I asked. My voice was calm, too calm. He blinked. "A toothbrush? Whose?" He shrugged, setting the bag down. "Maybe Ethan's. Kids lose those things. I bought extras." "Where?" "At the store," he said quickly, too quickly. "Ethan says you bought it for him, at Grace's house." His jaw tightened, a flicker across his face. He must have mixed it up, you know how kids are. But I knew, mothers always know. We ate dinner in silence that night. Richard chewed too fast, too loud. Ethan chattered about a science project, oblivious to the way my fork clattered against the plate. Afterward, I tucked my boy into bed, smoothing his hair, forcing my voice steady as I kissed his forehead. "Do you like going to Grace's house?" I asked softly. He nodded, eyes shining with innocence. "She makes grilled cheese with the crusts cut off. Daddy says it's okay. Sometimes her little girl plays with me." Little girl, the word sliced through me. Mrs. Carver had been right. Grace did have a child, and my husband had folded my son into that hidden world without my consent, without even my knowledge. I whispered good night and closed his door, but inside me something was splintering. Later, when Richard slipped into bed, smelling faintly of soap that wasn't ours, I lay stiff as wood. "You're quiet," he said. "I'm tired," I answered. He turned over, already half asleep. But I stared at the ceiling, the toothbrush burning in my mind, the blue plastic handle glowing like a signal flare. It was proof, small but undeniable, that my family was no longer mine alone. The perfect life I had paraded at church, at block parties, in holiday cards, it was a photograph curling at the edges. And the more I tried to flatten it, the more it revealed its cracks. In the quiet, I whispered to myself the truth I wasn't ready to say aloud. Someone else was living a version of my marriage, just 3 houses away, and my son had already been given a toothbrush in that life. And once a child brushes his teeth in another home, can he ever unlearn the taste of belonging there? Sleep has a way of abandoning you when you need it most. That night, I lay in the dark beside Richard, listening to his steady breathing, and felt like I was sharing a bed with a stranger. The ceiling above me seemed wider than the sky, every crack like a map leading me to places I didn't want to go. The toothbrush sat in the bathroom cabinet, silent but louder than thunder. I had tucked it behind a stack of folded towels, as though hiding it might erase the truth it carried. But even with the door closed, I felt its presence, daring me to confront what I already feared, that another household existed with my husband's name stitched into its fabric. I thought of Ethan, His smile when he spoke of strawberry toothpaste, the way he mentioned Grace's little girl as if it were the most natural thing. My son had a secret playmate, a sister of sorts, and I hadn't even known. What else was happening under my nose? The night grew longer. Memories replayed themselves like old home movies. Richard working late, calling from the office with muffled background noise. Richard carrying grocery bags that never seemed to match our shopping list. Richard's shirt smelling faintly of lavender when my detergent was lemon. At the time, I let each moment slide by. Now, strung together, they formed a necklace of betrayals I hadn't wanted to wear. I turned onto my side, facing Richard's back. In the dark, I traced the curve of his shoulder with my eyes. This was the man who once carried me across the threshold of our first apartment, who held me through 2 miscarriages, who promised me, hand over hand on the Bible at our wedding, that we were one life, one love, one home. But what did a promise mean if it could be split between 2 front doors? I rose quietly and padded down the hall to Ethan's room. He was asleep, one arm flung over his stuffed bear, his lips slightly parted. Children sleep like the world hasn't touched them yet. I knelt by his bed, brushing the hair from his forehead, and whispered, "You only have one mother, baby, don't forget." He stirred but didn't wake. I kissed his temple and pulled the blanket to his chin, but my own heart was bare, raw with questions. Back in the kitchen, I poured myself tea I didn't drink. The house was so still I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the old wall clock. Each sound reminded me how alone I was in my suspicions. Richard dismissed my questions with a shrug. Ethan didn't even realize there was anything wrong. The neighbors whispered, but none of them knew the whole of it. Only I carried the burden of putting the pieces together. I thought about calling my sister in Denver. She had warned me once that Richard's charm was a coin he spent too freely. But what would I say? My husband bought a toothbrush for our son and left it at another woman's house. It sounded small, almost laughable. Yet small things are what break marriages. One secret, one lie, one toothbrush. The clock hands inched past midnight. My eyes burned, but my body refused to rest. Outside, the street was washed silver under the moon. I stood at the window, staring at Grace's house 3 doors down. One light glowed in an upstairs room. A shadow crossed the curtain. My stomach twisted. What if Richard was there now, even as he pretended to sleep beside me? What if he had built another bedtime ritual, another family routine, while I clutched my teacup in the dark? A dog barked down the block, snapping me from my thoughts. I drew the curtain shut, but the image lingered, the glow, the shadow, the possibility. Finally, at dawn, I drifted into a shallow sleep at the kitchen table, my cheek pressed to the wood. I dreamed of Ethan standing between 2 women, each with an outstretched hand. He looked from one to the other, unsure where to run. I reached for him, but he stepped away. His voice echoed in the dream, calling out "Mommy," but not to me. I woke with tears on my face, the tea cold in its cup, the sun bleeding into the sky. Richard walked in, whistling as he buttoned his shirt for another busy day. He kissed the top of my head as if nothing were broken. But I knew then, something was broken, and no amount of whistling, no number of grocery bags would fix it. The sleepless night had settled the matter. I could no longer ignore the truth pressing at the edges of my life. There was another world growing just 3 houses away, and my husband was planting roots in its soil. And I was done pretending not to see. By Tuesday, I had worn myself thin with questions. A woman can only polish silverware so many times before she realizes it's not the forks she's scrubbing but her own nerves. I needed more than whispers and toothbrushes. I needed to see. That afternoon, I left the house earlier than usual, pretending to run errands, but really I was circling the block like a detective who had misplaced her badge. The Arizona sun was sharp on the pavement, and my shadow stretched long ahead of me. I parked a few streets over, heart pounding as though I were committing a crime. In truth, I only wanted the truth. When the school bus pulled up at the corner, I ducked behind a neighbor's hedge. Ethan hopped down the steps, his backpack bouncing. Richard's car idled nearby. He got out, waved to our boy, and swept him up into a hug. From a distance, it looked like a perfect father-son moment. If I hadn't been watching with new eyes, I might have smiled. But then Richard didn't drive toward our house. He held Ethan's hand and began walking, and not in our direction. I followed at a distance, heart thudding in my ears. My hands trembled so badly I nearly dropped my purse. They turned down Maple Lane, the same street where Grace lived. I knew every house there, every mailbox, every flower bed. When they reached her gate, Richard didn't hesitate. He opened it like he'd done it 100 times, ushering Ethan inside. I crept closer, crouching behind the trunk of a mesquite tree. From there, I saw what I wasn't prepared to see. Grace stood at the door in a pale dress, her hair pulled back, her face lighting up as if she had been waiting for them. Ethan ran to her, arms open, like she were a second mother he'd missed all day. She bent to hug him, kissed the top of his head. My stomach nodded. Then a little girl appeared, small, curls tumbling, maybe 5 years old. She squealed when she saw Ethan, tugging his hand toward a basket of toys on the porch. He followed eagerly, his laugh ringing out in a way I hadn't heard in weeks. And then came the worst blow. Grace turned to Richard. He leaned down and pressed his lips to her cheek. It wasn't the polite kiss neighbors give. It was practiced, familiar, the kind of kiss that had a history. I bit down hard on my lip to stop the sound rising in my throat. Tears blurred my sight, but not enough to erase the image. My husband, my son, another woman, another child, all together like a family rehearsing lines I never knew were written. I wanted to storm across the street to tear Ethan from her arms, to demand answers from Richard in front of the whole block. But I couldn't move. My legs felt anchored in the dirt. I watched instead, every second carving itself into memory. They went inside. The door closed. The porch light clicked on even though the sun was still high, as though welcoming them into a world separate from mine. I stood there until my knees ached. When I finally walked home, my steps were heavy, every breath ragged. The neighborhood looked the same, sprinklers ticking, dogs barking, but I knew it wasn't. My life had split in two. Inside, the house felt cavernous. I sat at the kitchen table, tracing circles on the wood grain, replaying what I'd seen. Richard's hand on Grace's back, Ethan laughing with the little girl, Grace's eyes shining as if she had everything she wanted. The minutes bled into hours. When Richard finally came home with Ethan, the sun was dipping low. Ethan rushed in with a smile, cheeks flushed, chattering about playing dolls and blocks with Sophie. He didn't even realize his words were knives. Richard set down his briefcase, kissed my cheek perfunctorily, and said, "Traffic was a nightmare." I stared at him, silent. He met my eyes for half a second before looking away, already loosening his tie. That night after Ethan was in bed, I asked quietly, "Who is Sophie?" He paused, then forced a chuckle. "Just one of the neighborhood kids. Ethan must have met her on the bus." A lie, smooth and fast, practiced like all the others. I nodded, hiding my shaking hands under the table. But in my mind, I saw it clearly. The little girl's curls, the way she tugged Ethan's hand, the way Richard kissed Grace without shame. I went to bed without another word, but sleep never came. My heart had crossed a line with me into a place where there was no going back. Because now I didn't just suspect. I knew. Children leave clues without knowing it. A crayon mark on the wall. A toy forgotten in the yard. A scrap of paper folded into a pocket. Sometimes they are just remnants of play. Other times, they are the only map to truths adults would rather not face. It was a Wednesday afternoon when I found the drawing. Ethan had come home from school and dropped his backpack by the door, as he always did. I scolded him gently. "Shoes in the closet, honey. Backpack on the hook," but he only grinned, promised to do it later, and dashed off toward the kitchen. I bent to pick it up myself, grumbling out of habit when a corner of paper peeked from the notebook wedged inside. The edges were crumpled as if it had been handled many times. I pulled it free. It was a drawing, childish but careful, in Ethan's uneven hand. Two women stood side by side, each labeled with the same word written in shaky block letters. Mommy. Between them stood Ethan, holding both their hands. His smile stretched wide, but it was the kind of smile children draw when they want to make the world look better than it feels. My breath caught. My vision blurred. I sank into the nearest chair, the drawing trembling in my hands. Two mamas. On the left he had drawn me, brown hair tied back, a dress I often wore to church. On the right, a woman with long golden hair, a necklace, and a bright red smile. Grace. It could only be her. I pressed the paper flat against the table, as if smoothing it would smooth the ache in my chest. But the ache only deepened. Mom, where are the cookies? Ethan's voice rang from the kitchen. I quickly slid the drawing back into the notebook, wiping at my eyes. In the jar, sweetheart, just one before dinner. His footsteps pattered across the floor. He didn't notice my shaking hands. He didn't notice the way I looked at him, as though I were trying to memorize his innocence before it slipped away. Later that night, after Richard had gone to bed and the house was hushed, I retrieved the notebook from Ethan's room. I sat cross-legged on the rug, the lamp casting a soft circle of light. Page after page of his drawings told a story he didn't know how to put into words. One picture showed a man, Richard, standing between two houses. One had a red door. The other had Grace's blue one. Above each roof, Ethan had scrawled a sun. But on the second house, he had drawn two suns, as if that place shone brighter. Another picture showed a picnic. Ethan between two women again, one offering him an apple, the other a sandwich. Page after page, my boy revealed the double life we were trapped inside. And though the crayon strokes were clumsy, the message was clear. My son was being torn in two. I pressed the notebook to my chest, tears spilling hot and fast. I wanted to protect him from all of it, from the lies, from the confusion, from the betrayal. But how could I, when the very man I had trusted to build this family was the one unraveling it? The next day, I tried to speak gently. Ethan, honey, about your pictures. He looked up from his cereal, spoon in hand. Do you like them? They're very good, I said, my throat tightened. But why did you draw two mamas? He frowned as if I had asked something silly. Because I have two, you and Mommy Grace. I nearly dropped my coffee mug. Sweetheart, you have one mother, me. He shook his head, chewing thoughtfully. But she takes care of me too. She makes me sandwiches and she tells me stories. She says I can call her Mommy if I want. Daddy said it was okay. The words struck like stones. My hand reached out instinctively, covering his. Listen to me, Ethan. You only have one mother, that's me, no one else. He looked at me then, really looked, with eyes too old for his years. But if you're my mommy and she's my mommy, does that mean Daddy has two wives? My breath stopped. I forced a smile, kissed his cheek, and said, Finish your cereal, love, we'll be late for school. But inside, my heart was shattering. That night, when Richard climbed into bed, I lay stiffly on my side, clutching the notebook under my pillow like a secret weapon. The drawings burned against me, proof in crayon that no excuse could erase. I stared at the dark ceiling, listening to the sound of his steady breathing. A man can hide from his wife, from his neighbors, even from himself. But he cannot hide from the truth his child carries. And my child had already drawn it in bright, undeniable color. By the time Saturday rolled around, the crayon drawings had worn a hole in my chest. I had read them again and again at night, tracing Ethan's uneven letters, staring at the two houses, the two sons, the two women he called Mommy. My husband's lies were no longer whispers, they were pictures taped to the inside of my eyelids, images that wouldn't let me sleep. I decided I couldn't keep carrying them in silence. The afternoon air was heavy with heat. Richard was out in the yard trimming hedges, pretending at normalcy. I watched him from the kitchen window, his shirt clinging to his back, sweat on his temples. A man working hard, yes, but not at the life he had promised me. I stepped outside, my fists clenched at my sides. "We need to talk," I said. He looked up, startled, wiping his forehead with the back of his arm. "About what?" I didn't waste words. I held up the notebook, flipping it open to the drawing that had broken me the most, the one where Ethan stood between two houses, both suns shining above him. Richard's face changed. He tried to laugh it off. "It's a child's drawing, Linda." "No," I said firmly. "It's a child's truth." He set the hedge clippers down with a clatter. "You're overreacting." "Am I?" My voice trembled, but I didn't care. "He calls her Mommy, Richard. He draws her house with sunshine. He tells me about strawberry toothpaste and sandwiches she makes him. Do you have any idea what that means? He thinks he has two mothers." He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit I knew too well. "Linda, kids get confused. Grace is kind to him, that's all. Kindness doesn't explain toothbrushes. It doesn't explain why our son knows her little girl's name. And it certainly doesn't explain why I saw you walk him straight into her house after school." That silenced him, his jaw flexed. He stared at me, then at the ground, as though answers might be hiding in the grass. "Tell me the truth," I pressed. My voice cracked, but I stood tall. "Do you have another family with her?" He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You don't understand." "Then make me understand." But he didn't. He turned, muttering something about needing air, and started toward his car. I followed him down the driveway, my heart pounding in my ears. "Don't you walk away from me, Richard. Not this time." He spun around at the gate, his eyes flashing. "What do you want me to say? That I made mistakes? That I needed something different? You always look at me like I'm already guilty." "Because you are," I whispered. His mouth opened, then closed. He got in the car and drove off, leaving the hedge clippers in the yard, the gate swinging behind him, and me trembling on the sidewalk. I could have collapsed there. I could have swallowed the tears and crawled back into the house. But instead, I lifted my chin and walked, not away from the truth, but toward it, toward Grace's house. The bungalow looked quiet, deceptively innocent with its flower pots and lace curtains. I stood at the gate, my hand gripping the iron, my body shaking so badly I could barely breathe, but I pushed it open. Each step up the walkway felt like climbing a mountain. I knocked. Grace answered almost immediately, as if she had been expecting someone. She wore a pale blouse, her hair loose around her shoulders. She smiled at first, but when she saw my face, the smile froze. "Linda," she said softly. I held up the notebook like a weapon. "How long?" Her eyes darted to the side. Don't lie to me," I snapped. My voice rose, louder than I had ever heard it. "How long have you been sharing my husband? How long have you been letting my son call you Mommy?" She paled, gripping the edge of the doorframe. "Please, don't do this here." "Where else should I do it? Behind closed doors, the way you've been doing with him?" Her lips trembled. For a moment, I thought she might deny it. But then her shoulders sagged. She opened the door wider, and I caught sight of the little girl, Sophie, peeking from the hallway with wide, curious eyes. My heart wrenched. Two children, two worlds colliding. Grace lowered her voice, urgent, pleading. "Linda, I never meant for it to happen this way. Richard, he promised he'd tell you." I nearly laughed, the sound bitter. "Promised? He's been promising me 30 years. She reached out, as if to touch my arm, but I stepped back. The heat of betrayal was enough. I didn't need her pity. "Do you love him?" I asked. The question escaped before I could stop it. Her silence was louder than an answer. I turned on my heel, the notebook clutched to my chest like armor. As I walked away, Sophie's small voice called out, "Mommy, who is that lady?" I didn't look back. I couldn't. Back at my own house, I collapsed into the kitchen chair. The world was spinning, the walls closing in. But one truth stood firm: there was no hiding anymore. My son's drawings, my husband's lies, Grace's trembling eyes, they were all pieces of the same puzzle. And now, for better or worse, the picture was clear. I had spent years setting tables, birthday cakes for Ethan, Thanksgiving turkeys, Christmas hams, but never had I laid a table with hands so unsteady. The china clinked against itself as if it knew the weight of what was coming. Every fork, every folded napkin felt like a soldier I was arranging for battle. It was Friday night when I decided. Enough secrets. Enough stolen moments in kitchens 3 doors down. If Richard would not tell the truth, then I would drag it into the light myself. I told him over breakfast, my voice steady, though my insides shook. I want to have Grace for dinner. She's been kind to Ethan. It's only right. His spoon paused over the cereal bowl. For a heartbeat, something flickered across his face, shock, fear, maybe guilt. But then he nodded too quickly. Of course, a neighborly thing to do. He thought I was playing the fool. Let him think it. Sometimes a woman must let her husband underestimate her just long enough to build the gallows. That evening, I roasted chicken with rosemary, mashed potatoes smooth as silk, and baked a peach cobbler Ethan loved. On the surface, it looked like any other family meal, but beneath it was a stage, and I had written the script. When Grace arrived, Sophie clutching her hand, the air thickened. My son lit up, rushing to hug Sophie, dragging her to show the crayons in his room. Their laughter floated down the hallway like bells. Richard cleared his throat, shifting in his chair, the picture of a man trapped between 2 fires. "Let's sit," he said. We did. I poured wine for the adults, milk for the children. Conversations stumbled along at first, whether school projects, the price of gas. My voice was calm, almost sweet, though my heart pounded against my ribs. It was Ethan who tipped the evening. He was telling Sophie about his drawings. "I made one of both my mamas," he said proudly, holding up a page from his notebook. "This is Mommy Linda and this is Mommy Grace." Silence fell like a dropped curtain. Richard's fork froze midair. Grace's eyes darted to mine, wide, pleading, and finally, I let the truth breathe. "Ethan," I said gently, though my gaze was locked on Richard, "why do you think you have 2 mamas?" He blinked, confused by the tension. "Because Daddy says it's okay. Sometimes I'm at this house, and sometimes I'm at Grace's. And they both take care of me, so that means I have 2. My chest burned, but I didn't flinch. "Do you hear that, Richard?" He set the fork down, his jaw clenched. "Linda, this isn't the time." "It's exactly the time," I cut in, my voice sharp as broken glass. "Our son thinks he belongs to 2 homes, 2 mothers, and you've let it happen." Ethan looked between us, bewildered. His lower lip trembled. Did I do something wrong? I reached across the table, took his small hand in mine. "No, sweetheart, none of this is your fault." Grace rose slightly from her chair, her face pale. "Linda, please, don't do this in front of the children." "Where else?" I snapped, my voice shook, but it carried. "You already did it in front of them. Every hug, every sandwich, every lie, you've both dragged them into it. Now they deserve the truth." Richard pushed back his chair, his temper flashing. "Enough." But Ethan was already crying, clutching my arm, sobbing so loudly it drowned everything else. "I don't want 2 mamas, I just want one. I don't understand." The sound tore through me. His innocence cracked wide open at the table where we were supposed to be safe. His little voice was the verdict none of us could escape. Grace covered her face with her hands. Sophie whimpered, hiding against her mother's side. And Richard, his shoulders sagged, his mask slipping. For once, he didn't try to spin a story. He didn't have one left to tell. I gathered Ethan into my lap, rocking him, whispering, "You have me, always me, one mother who will never leave you." His sobs quieted, his face pressed against my shoulder, but my own tears slid freely, dripping onto his hair. The dinner sat cooling on the table, untouched. The candles flickered, shadows leaping across our faces, and in that moment it was no longer a home, no longer a gathering. It was a reckoning. No one ate dessert. When Grace finally rose to leave Sophie in her arms, she couldn't meet my eyes. Richard walked them out, his head bowed, his steps slow. I stayed in the chair, Ethan still clinging to me, the notebook open on the table like evidence. The family I had spent decades building was fractured, but at least now, the lies were in the open, where they could no longer hide. The morning after that dinner felt like the aftermath of a storm. Plates still sat in the sink, food untouched on the counter, napkins crumpled like wounded flags. The silence in the house was heavy, broken only by the sound of Ethan's small footsteps as he padded into the kitchen, clutching his stuffed bear. "Mom," he whispered, "are you mad at me?" I bent down, my arms circling him, my voice thick. "No, baby, never at you. You did nothing wrong." But he pulled back, eyes wide and wet. "Then why did Daddy look so mad? Why did everyone cry?" I smoothed his hair, swallowing the ache. Because sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, and sometimes the truth hurts before it heals. He frowned, holding his bear tighter. "I don't want to, Mom is, I just want you." Those words sank into me like both a dagger and a bomb. I kissed his forehead and promised, "You'll always have me." By mid-morning, Richard returned from wherever he had fled the night before. He came in quietly, without his usual whistle, his shoulders hunched as if the weight of the world had settled there. He stood in the doorway, staring at me while I washed dishes that didn't need washing. "Linda," he began, but his voice cracked. He cleared his throat. "We need to talk." I turned, drying my hands on a towel. "Yes, we do." We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where the night before had broken us. He kept his eyes on his hands, fingers tapping against the wood, a rhythm of guilt. "I didn't plan for it," he said finally. "Grace, it just happened." I laughed bitterly. "You don't just happen into another family, Richard. You build it, brick by brick, lie by lie." His head dropped lower. "It started years ago. I was lonely. You were busy with Ethan, with the house." She listened. She made me feel younger needed. My chest tightened. "I gave you everything, my youth, my dreams, my body when it was strong, my care when it was tired. I gave you a son, and you repaid me by planting yourself 3 doors down." He flinched at my words but didn't deny them. "And the child?" I asked. My voice was icy, though tears burned in my throat. "Sophie, is she yours?" His silence was answer enough. I pressed my palms to the table to steady myself. "So you weren't just cheating on me. You were living 2 lives, 2 homes, 2 families." He looked up then, eyes red, desperate. "I didn't mean for Ethan to get caught up in it. I thought I could keep it separate." "Separate?" I hissed. "You bought him a toothbrush there. You let him call her mommy. You let our boy believe he belonged to 2 worlds. That is not separate, Richard. That is betrayal." At that moment, Ethan wandered into the room, clutching his bear. He climbed into my lap, sensing the tension, his small body trembling. He looked at Richard with a child's bluntness. "Daddy, why do I have 2 mamas?" Richard's face crumbled. He covered his eyes with his hands, shoulders shaking. When he spoke, his voice was ragged. "Because I made a terrible mistake, son, and it's not your fault." Ethan turned to me, confused, frightened. "Is Daddy leaving?" I hugged him close, whispering, "No matter what happens, I'm here, you're safe." Richard reached across the table, his hand trembling. "Linda, I'll end it. I'll walk away from Grace, from everything. Just don't take Ethan from me." I met his eyes, steady and cold. "You already took something from him. His innocence, his certainty about who his family is. You don't get to erase that with promises." He dropped his hand, defeated. The rest of the day passed in fragments. Richard pacing the living room, Ethan hiding in his room, coloring silently. Me moving through the house like a ghost, folding laundry, watering plants, doing everything except collapsing into the grief clawing at me. By evening, the air grew heavy again. Grace appeared at the gate, Sophie at her side. Her eyes were rimmed red, her face pale. She called softly, "Richard." I stepped out before he could. "No," I said firmly. "Not here, not anymore." She flinched, hugging Sophie closer. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never wanted to hurt anyone." "Then you shouldn't have taken what wasn't yours," I replied. My voice didn't rise, but it carried. Ethan had followed me to the doorway. He clutched my hand, his small voice breaking the silence. "Mommy, please don't let her take Daddy." The words tore through every adult standing there. Grace's lips trembled, Richard's eyes closed, and my own tears spilled freely. I knelt, holding Ethan's face between my hands. "Listen to me, love. No one will ever take me from you. I'm your mother. That's a truth no one can change." His tears dampened my palms. He nodded, burying his face against me. Behind us, Richard whispered, "I'll tell her it's over." But the damage had already been done. Truth was finally in the open. It had cracked us wide, left us bleeding. And though it set me free from the fog of lies, it also bound me to the painful task of rebuilding a life from the rubble. The night closed in around us. Grace turned and walked away with Sophie. Richard sank into the porch chair, his head in his hands. I carried Ethan inside, his arms looped around my neck, his breath warm against my shoulder. I whispered to him as I climbed the stairs, "We'll be okay. Somehow, we'll be okay." But even as I said it, I knew the truth, that nothing about our lives would ever be the same again. The weeks after Richard's confession blurred into one another, like rain streaking down a window pane. Some days I woke angry, other days numb. But every day I woke determined that Ethan would not be the casualty of our broken vows. Richard moved into the guest room first, then into an apartment across town. There were no more excuses, no more late-night meetings. He came to visit Ethan, sometimes took him for ice cream or to the park, but he was a visitor now, not the anchor of our home. I watched my son carefully, searching his face for cracks. Children can carry burdens heavier than they should, but Ethan still laughed at cartoons, still begged for cookies, still curled against me at bedtime. One night, as I tucked him in, he whispered, "I only call you Mommy now." Tears welled in my eyes. "That's all I ever needed, baby." Grace stayed 3 doors down, though we passed one another rarely. When we did, our eyes met briefly, a silent acknowledgement of wreckage neither of us could undo. Her little girl, Sophie, waved at Ethan from time to time, but I gently steered him inside. Some lines had to stay drawn. The house felt emptier without Richard's heavy steps, his voice booming about clients and deadlines. Yet in that emptiness, I found a strange peace. I started reading again, the novels I had abandoned years ago. I planted herbs in the kitchen window. I called my sister more often, and I laughed with Ethan, not out of obligation but out of joy that still, somehow, lived inside us. Divorce papers came. They were signed quickly, without fight. Richard didn't ask for custody, perhaps guilt weighed too heavily, or perhaps he knew Ethan's heart already chose where it belonged. Either way, the gavel came down and 30 years of marriage ended with the scrape of a pen. I thought I would feel destroyed. Instead, I felt lighter. Broken, yes, but also free. One Sunday, I took Ethan to church alone. We sat in our pew, just the two of us. Sunlight streamed through stained glass, warming our joined hands. During the hymn, Ethan's small voice rose beside mine, off-key but strong. And I realized then, our family was smaller but not weaker. We were enough. In time, neighbors stopped whispering. The scandal faded, replaced by new gossip, new distractions. But I carried the lesson with me every day: truth, no matter how painful, is the only soil where healing can grow. I am 53 years old. I have lived through betrayal, through nights where sleep would not come, through the ache of watching my son call another woman Mommy. But I have also lived to see him run into my arms, to hear his voice claim me as his one and only. That, more than anything, is my victory. Life did not give me the ending I wanted, but it gave me the chance to begin again. So to those listening to my story, I say this: if you ever find yourself standing at the gate of a truth you do not want to face, be brave enough to open it. Even if what waits inside shatters you, it may also set you free. Thank you for staying with me through this story on family revenge secrets. These tales are not meant to judge, but to remind us that courage, even in heartbreak, can guide us toward brighter days. I wish each of you health, strength, and the love of a family that stands unshaken. Treasure the people who call you mommy, dad, son, or daughter. Those words are sacred. Until the next story, may your home be filled with peace, and may your family always know happiness.